Pima Kachan Tribe, Pachanga Band of Luiseno Indians, San Pascual Band of Mission Indians, and Agua Caliente Band of
Run.
Half size is better than no size.
Touch your face. I hope the screensaver's off.
Before Columbus arrived in 1492, American Indians, Native people, the indigenous peoples in the Americas, their cultures were very rich and vibrant and had been going on for thousands and thousands of years. At the time, scholars say maybe about 5 million to 10 million, maybe as high as 25 million people who were already here when Columbus arrived. The settlers pushed westward. Then what that meant that they were entering Indian country. They saw these new peoples, these white strangers, as intruders. There's over 1,500 wars and battles and skirmishes and attacks authorized by the United States government against indigenous people. By the time of Columbus, was about 5 million. Their population by 1900 will actually drop below 238,000. A lot of non-Indian people begin to believe that it was to vanish America, that Native people were going to be a vanishing race. Early anthropologists who were just beginning to be trained in the field, because anthropology was a new field, then began to rush to the West to study Indian languages like John Harrington, because they wanted to record the cultures, because there would be no more Indians left.
Time is of the essence. We had to capture these things, get them on record before they all died off. He wrote me a letter saying, "You and I are nothing."
Will both of us soon be dust? If you can grab these dying languages before the old-timers completely die off, you will be doing one of the few things valuable to the people of the remote future. The time will come, and soon, when there won't be an Indian language left. All the languages developed for thousands of years will be ashes. The house is afire. It is burning.
And I often think of that letter because it's very true. This is the distant future, 70 years later or so. It's here.
We are going to be researching Harrington's notes, finding out how to access them online.
This shows streets where it still exists where we live now, and that just shows where they are, and we can relate to that because we know exactly where that is.
Well, yes. That's your family.
Yes.
Go up to Choro Street. And you know how
Between Sycamore and Peach
yeah,
Street.
you know how they named
My daddy-in-law lives.
And what we're doing here is a workshop called the Breath of Life Language Workshop for California Indians. And it's primarily oriented toward California Indians who have no speakers left, but that want a connection with their language.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Reel 1, what we're looking at is all oral history. So it's extremely important because if we have at least one paragraph, it gives us so many more words in terms of creating language.
The Harrington materials, the Harrington field notes that are at the Smithsonian are now available to anybody in the public at any time, so long as they got a computer and an internet connection.
J.P. Harrington was a one-of-a-kind American ethnologist and linguist.
He could pick up languages easily. He had very good ear for phonetic recording. So his transcription of native words is extremely accurate.
Harrington developed an almost phonetic plan of recording every particular Indian that you run into, get all the information he could before that elderly Indian died off and the language went with him.
To the last breath, he was right there in your face, getting the last word. Because he was so feverishly busy gathering all the information he could before a lot of these older Indians died.
When it became obvious that J.P. Harrington was sick, in fact he was on his deathbed in the Bureau of American Ethnology, that's what J.P. Harrington was working for, they knew he had extensive notes all over the country, including 2 warehouses in Washington, D.C. And Mary R. Haas, my mentor, asked if I would undertake this task, and I was quite honored. When I opened up those boxes, I found Harrington's life.
He was a Yankee. He was born in Waltham, Massachusetts in 1884. His father's name was Elliot Augustus Harrington, and Harrington's a very old New England name. And his mother's name was Mary Lydia Peabody. Now Peabody's one of the biggest, oldest names, only it seems she was from a rather middle-class branch of the Peabodys. He didn't come from kind of the upper stratum of Yankee society, but he was superbly educated. He always talked with a Yankee accent. 1890-ish, the family decided to move to California. They all hopped on the train. Harrington he was 7. He remembers being impressed when they were on this train trip coming across the country. They got to, I believe it was Needles, California. And the Mojave Indians used to stand at the train station and sell pottery and weavings and jewelry and things. And Harrington remembers seeing Indians and being fascinated by them. He was only about 7 years old, but he seemed to remember that as being something that was very important in his life. When he was 18 years old in 1902, he graduated from high school. He said he was already doing field work with Santa Ynez Indians. You could say that was the beginning of his field work. It was clear that John was intelligent enough to go to university, and he decided on Stanford. He did what we would call majoring in classics and German, and Harrington just excelled at Stanford. He was recommended to take the exam for a Rhodes Scholarship, one of the most prestigious scholarships in the world, to go to Oxford and study. Instead, he went to Germany to study.
He learned phonetics. He was a very good phonetician. He transcribed the sounds of speech almost at dictation speed. When he returned, there wasn't any major work being done on California languages except for the University of California at Berkeley, whom he apparently approached, but A.L. Kroeber, who was in charge of the program, preferred to work with either do it himself or work with his own students. And I don't know the full story, but he seems to have kind of pushed Harrington away. So what Harrington did was find a job as a school teacher to support himself. And then in any time he had available, weekends, summer vacations, spring break, whenever he was free, he worked with elderly speakers of the Indian languages.
April 21, 1914. My dear Loomis, I have never in my life made such a haul of absolutely wonderful and forever unique Indian information as during the past week here at Highland. We have been able to re-people all Los Angeles County with a race which is well nigh extinct and make a record of a language which has not been spoken for nearly a century.
He's teaching high school because he needs a job, and then he goes to summer school at Berkeley. Kroeber was a kingmaker in his own way. He decided who did what in California. He kind of divided up the territory. And he had already worked on Chumash, which of course is Harrington's great love. But Kroeber decided, if you want to work on something, forget the Chumash, go and work on Mojave. So he sent him down to Mojave or Needles.
Leaving San Bernardino at night, we climb through the Cajon Pass and descend the northern slopes of the San Bernardino Range. We soon reach the desolate sink of the Mojave River, and from there, until morning, glide across tracts of sandy desert until at last we climb through a gap and find ourselves at Needles by the Colorado River in the land of the Mojave. June 1907. This is the first Indian language I ever recorded. Informant, a young Mojave woman at Needles.
There's a handful of fluent speakers left here on the Fort Mojave Indian Reservation. That's very hard to say that there's only a handful left, that our language is endangered and our ways of life are endangered.
The only time I get to see her, talk to you, so you guys bring her, when you guys come. Pagkahan sa niya akin si Mama Tim. And si Juan. And si Juan. Oh, yeah. Mama. What's the fun? Sa niya akin siya, si Mama. Kung sumay, kung sumay. Siya suwal. Pipat pa suwal. Kung we say Sarah's, you know. Yeah, but man, tinod them, middle, man. Logan Biden. Middle, man.
There was this man that came through here a long time ago, a white man by the name of Harrington, and he took a lot of notes in the Mojave language. Back in like 1907.
Oh, I wouldn't know that.
You never heard of him?
I never heard of it.
When he was out in Mojave, Harrington got typhoid. And he was in the hospital for a couple of weeks. He almost died out in the desert there in the hospital. There was another time he wandered out into the Mojave Desert looking for somebody. Got lost, and even in LA Times, you know, this linguist had been found almost dead out into the Mojave Desert. Then finally in 1915, he got his job as an ethnographer at Bureau of American Ethnology. I think if they had known when they took him on that he wasn't about to be an armchair anthropologist back in Washington, D.C. 9 months of the year, you know, it might have been different. But he managed to stay in their good graces, and he would only come back there when they would hold his paychecks up, you know. Say, you gotta come back and collect them yourself.
He would be assigned a topic from the Bureau. You know, go to Southern California and study traditional houses. So he would come to Southern California and do that, but then on the side, working with these people, collecting additional notes, but then turn his assignment on the housing, but keep all his other notes on the side. So he was just constantly working nonstop.
He was a man that worked 18 hours a day regularly. Never had a telephone, so he couldn't be interrupted.
After lunch, we drove on about a mile further up the valley and found the Rincon Indians just coming out of a council. Among these Indians was Juan Escalac, a man about 60 years old who spoke very beautiful Spanish and is a sort of leader among the Indians. He said he knows all the place names around Rincon.
Harrington was here from 1925 to 1938, off and on, you know, between his different tribal communities.
One of the things about Harrington,
he loved to name places. Thank goodness that was his pet peeve.
So he's seen all this landscape. And as he's going through the landscape, the informant, the people that are with him are saying, this is that place. It's Yorushwa. It comes from Urushat, which is soapstone, hill. But he's just taking this imperfect information that others would consider imperfect, but it's the real information. It grounds it in an older time.
And I can't go a mile in town without seeing this invisible name above the place, like on our maps. We call it the Harrington database, but really the database comes from the ancestors. Those are the informants. They had the wherewithal to speak to this man, and very private, very ceremonial, very religious, and they're sharing with them.
I have letter after letter where he emphasizes this, get to them now, because when they die, the language goes with them. The younger ones are not learning the language. They're certainly not learning the language or the old ancient stories or songs from days gone by years ago that have been passed down by word of mouth over thousands of years.
The entire Western Hemisphere was really American Indian people's land. After the so-called Indian Wars, General Phil Sheridan, who was the commander of the U.S. military in the West, introduced something called a winter campaign. And that meant was to attack Native people during the winter time. It would be cold, snow on the ground. If they could find Native people, they could easily defeat them there. There was also another campaign, Scorching the Earth, which means total war. And the idea of total war is to capture women and children, but also to destroy all the crops and destroy the communities. In the late 1800s, then they're forced onto reservations, and they're placed into poverty, ill conditions, a lot of diseases, flu and cholera, even measles. And the term is not used yet, but we can apply this term in the 20th century to this time as prisoners of war. There's some tribes who lost their entire communities, and in particular, California is one of them. The gold rush in California in 1848, when gold is discovered. It's that speeds up westward expansion and the pushing of Native people to the side, and so that really depletes the Indian population. If you look at that from the American Indian point of view, it's really a form of genocide.
The boarding schools, that was where the survivors were sent to be assimilated.
And even now, some of the families didn't want to teach the young ones because they remember boarding school. They remember the punishments like my grandmother does and my auntie did, and what they said to them and how they whipped them, even if they said one word in Mojave.
But most important, I think that people need to understand that our language was taken from us. We were not allowed to speak it. And that's why it's gone. It's not gone because we didn't want to speak it. It's gone because it was taken from us.
The Creator gave us all these things, the land, the water, the air, and told us how to live, and gave us our natural order, commandments of who we are and what we are. And that was in that language.
Dear Mr. Hodge, to show you how much I have the success of this work at heart, I have purchased a new Ford touring car for the sole purpose of collecting Indian place names and facilitating this work. It is a dandy, and in this car I shall be able to take a number of the old informants to visit important places, incidental to other pressing work. The collecting of these place names is an important phase of the ethnology and archaeology here.
Kroeber, like most anthropologists of the time, liked to declare that a language was dead. And Harrington delighted in finding speakers of languages that Kroeber at Berkeley hadn't found. There's always the possibility that somebody would turn up if you only ask enough people in the native community so that you can find that person.
He had a charm that he could turn on. He could walk into a room full of Indians that he'd never seen before, And the first thing you know, he's sitting down, asking them what this word or that word meant, and how do you pronounce it.
He didn't want to be a professor of linguistics or anthropology. He kept away from professional colleagues, and so he ended up being this mystery man.
I met Dr. John P. Harrington in 1932 when he moved into the duplex next door to my family home in Santa Ana, California. From there, he started training me to run his recording machine. I would work in his house at the day, and he paid me 25 cents a day. Sometimes you'd forget. But that was not bad money for a 13-year-old or so, starting out in 1933 in those years.
Dear Jack, remember, this is slow, careful work, ferreting out the ones that know the stories and ancient myths. Some that say they don't know them, know lots of them. Some that say they don't talk the language, talk plenty of it. If you can't get stories, get songs and get talk, bushels of dictation about anything in the world in Indian. Keep the turntable whirling all day and evening, any kind of talk.
It was during this time that he met and married Cara Beth.
She took his class in phonetics at what's now San Diego State, I guess. She was the best student in the class. She showed real promise as a politician.
And the fact that he got married at all is quite astounding.
And she was initially very much impressed with his dedication and the fact that he would come into the classroom like a god on a thundercloud.
When he walked into the rather dim classroom on the first morning of summer session, my heart, already strained past endurance, seemed to stop. I silently and romantically exclaimed that he looked like an angry god. I had not hoped so soon to encounter one of those mythical creatures, a scholar, a scientist, who was also young and beautiful. I do remember arriving at Santa Ynez in spring of 1916. I have not forgotten the thrill of when Harrington met me, and I knew I was about to share his life and his career. The plan had been for me to learn to type fast enough to take Harrington's dictation.
Cara Beth, who was a fantastic ethnographer and linguist in her own right. That might have been one of the reasons Harrington married her, so he could use her as a field worker and record even more languages.
Harrington's informant in Santa Ynez was a very ancient Chumash woman. She must have been 90 or thereabouts. Harrington had me listen to her Chumash words while he smiled and cupped his ear and asked her to repeat until her patience wore thin. She frequently treated him with the indulgence that one would accord a child or a harmless madman.
Maria Solares is our ancestor, my fifth great grandmother, who worked with J.P. Harrington and gave him pretty much all of the information with regards to our language, our stories, our songs, our customs, our religion of our people. She is solely responsible for what we have today.
At the time of European contact, this region of California, the Chumash region, had the highest population density in all of Aboriginal California, and one of the highest population densities in North America. Right away, the missionaries wanted to establish missions among the Chumash. And so beginning in 1772, over about a 40-year period, people were gradually baptized and would relocate to the missions. But eventually the introduced European diseases really began to take a toll among children and infants. And so by the end of the mission period, after 50, 60 years of missions being here, there was only about 10% of the population that had been here. Around the beginning of the 20th century, some of the Chumash languages were no longer spoken. Others were down to just one or two or a handful of speakers.
Maria Solares was born to save the language. I truly believe that. She was born around the time that the smallpox were around. They kept her inside a lot, and she has a story of her being inside a lot, not being able to go out to play with the kids because the elders wanted to give her the stories and the language. So they knew she was precious. They knew that somewhere in her life that she was going to say our stories, our language, our customs, our traditions, our songs.
It is my belief that she knew what she was doing. She knew what she left was going to be written down and saved by this man that's coming through to interview her and spend a lot of time with her. I don't think their interactions were always pleasant. He was a very demanding man from what we can read in the notes. And it's amazing when we go through the notes, we can kind of hear some frustration in some of the comments that she makes. So we can get somewhat of her personality through the notes as well.
One time I saw there was a note where he said, he suggested a possible other way to say something, and she wouldn't okay it. And he wrote something like, informant stubbornly refuses to okay my suggestion. I thought, dude, it's her language. If it doesn't sound right, it doesn't sound right.
Once a week, we drove down to the store for supplies and to pick up mail. Harrington was excited to find an invitation to attend a meeting of his colleagues at Berkeley. Alfred Kroeber was to preside. Harrington envied his status, his resources, his facility with which he published regularly, and at the same time, he held his linguistic abilities in something like contempt. Harrington said, the whole idea of my going along was extravagant, unsuitable, and not to be considered, and he'd be gone 4 days at the most. Into the second week, I began to worry. I was running low on food. I would not believe any man could bring himself to leave a wife whom he said he loved alone in the 8th month of pregnancy without food, money, or transportation, not yet accepting the fact that this man was cast in a different mold.
He would try to spend as much time as he could in the field, hiding from his superiors in the Smithsonian. He hated to be stuck in the office in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian and write.
Harrington said that he was going to have to stave off the return to Washington as long as possible, but he would surely have to publish. But he saw no reason why my time should be wasted. I would therefore take myself to Parker, Arizona, to gather all that I possibly could on the Chemehueve. The Chemehueve, he said, spoke a Uto-Aztecan language.
He thought he was probably doing her a great honor by, giving her so much responsibility in the work and sending her off to work on languages on her own, by trusting her. He rarely trusted anyone as much as he trusted Karabakh. It was a very productive decade, but I think came to a crashing halt for him because he sent Karabakh off to work on Chemehueve and set her up with George Laird, who was a very good speaker of Chemehueve, and of course they fell in love. And Karabakh was a rather emotionally needy person herself. She finally found the emotional support she needed and would never have gotten in quite the same form from Harrington, even if they deeply loved each other and committed to each other. That was just not what he was capable of. And the divorce was finalized, and then I don't know that he ever saw Karabakh again. But they did have a daughter, Alona, and her name, by the way, is Tewa. It's Alona Willona. He rarely saw his daughter. She grew up with Karabakh's family. He was deeply shamed by that, by having to appear in divorce court. This is not something that the family really wanted, to discuss or anything, but that would be the point around 1920, 1921, is when, there was a big change in him. as a biographer, I would say that when his real reclusive traits kicked in was after his divorce from Caravan. That deeply hurt him.
He had a deep feeling for secrecy.
Dear Jackie, tell nobody the slightest thing of your business. Just say that you are from Los Angeles, that your name is Seeley, also that you have various addresses. Don't mention my name or anything about me whatsoever. Just take the bull by the horns. John.
The recording machine was a very top secret type of thing, and I was to tell no one anything at all about it, and certainly never give any records that I made of the Indians to anyone. This is the car that was built by Junkyard Parts. Harrington bought a new engine for it. It cost $50 installed. I sure put a lot of miles on it, traveling all over California, Oregon, and Washington with an old recording machine in it. It was overloaded all the time. The Indians loved this car. They loved to ride in, I guess because the color red was something they liked, because it was a bright fire engine red. Harrington had a big old black box that he carried camping gear and records and the recording machine. And on the back of that, it read Bureau of Ethnology. Nobody in the neighborhood knew what that was. They'd never heard the word ethnology.
Go from Eureka directly to Silence, Oregon. Get the street address of John Albert, the last one who knows the Alsea language formerly spoken in Silence. Dearest Jack, I've just gotten over crying. That is partly over. This is the worst thing that has ever happened to me. Now let's brush away our tears and see what can be done about it. You know, the paralyzed person often gets over the first stroke. Find out if he knew the real Chinook language or only the jargon. I read the Oakville letter and was so happy that you got John Albert to talk that I just screamed and said, God bless you. Alsea language next to Chinook. It is the rarest thing in the world. John Albert is the only living person who talks it. Don't tell anybody in Silence your business or get acquainted with any gossipers. Tell them nothing.
I learned years later from Arthur Harrington, his nephew, how Harrington became so secretive. And that was because in Santa Barbara, when he was a very young man, he dug into a burial area, and he found some bones of what he declared was the Santa Barbara man, and about 20,000 years old. From there, he got ridiculed by Kroeber, and I don't know if you've heard of it, because there were no Indians at that time known to exist 20,000 years ago. Kroeber got very irritated with him for not sharing his findings when he'd go from tribe to tribe after that. Harrington would secretly keep it all to himself.
Harrington was paranoid, and he just felt like Kroeber would steal his thunder and he wouldn't get any credit for the work he was doing.
As we later learned, he kept secret even from the Smithsonian the languages that he worked on and what he'd done with the notes that he took. He was an employee of the Bureau of American Ethnology. He was a government employee. And everything he produced on the job was, by definition, a U.S. government document. So he was violating the law by hiding these materials, but it was the habit of a lifetime. It was something that should be kept secret, it should be kept away from the eyes of people who would steal it and do the wrong things with it. What those wrong things were not very clear, probably not even to Harrington himself. And here we get into the really unpleasant side of Harrington's craziness. It was the Jews. Most of the prominent linguists of that period were Jewish. It was not considered socio-pathological earlier in the 20th century. It was a very fashionable thing to be anti-Semitic in the 20th century. I think I probably would have strongly disliked Harrington as a person if I'd ever known him, if only for that reason. Ironically, Kober was not Jewish. He was from a German-American family, grew up in New York. And Harrington refused to believe. He was given all kinds of information to the contrary, but he refused to believe that Kober was not Jewish. He must be, because he's my arch enemy. He's the one who wants to steal my stuff.
That's a crazy way to think about it, because he had a really, tight relationship with the native people.
I've thought of this same kind of contradiction myself on a couple of occasions. What it seems to me is that Harrington felt no threat from Indian people. And feeling no threat, he didn't project on them this kind of paranoid fear that he projected on his linguistic colleagues. And oddly enough, at that time, there was a great deal of racist antipathy focused on Indian people. To some extent, it still is. But Harrington never, ever, so far as I know, had a racist bone in his body when it came to Indian people. And in fact, went out of his way to be part of their lives in a way that most whites of that period would have found difficult, at least.
Between Harrington and these people, there was a connection that he didn't have with most of the rest of the academic world or with the Anglo Society. The Anglo Society was just telling funny stories about him. The Indians he was working with admired him. There seemed to be a respect among the native peoples for him that his own Anglo scholarly community really didn't have for him.
To walk in as white and tall and eccentric, that he just fit right in. I don't care where he was or who he was with. I don't think I've ever heard of him being thrown out by any Indian.
I was working with an Indian in Washington somewhere, and I wrote Harrington and said he had a stroke and he's dying. And you could almost feel the tears shake from the letter when I got the letter back from him. And he says, how many times have I left them, gone 2 weeks and come back and they're dead and their language gone with it?
Put it in the garage. That's my number 4 grandson. I tried to teach him and he just smiles at me. I know what you're saying, Grandma, that's all he says. That's the way you're supposed to talk. I said, like me. I said,
Enyach makav chidum, enyach makav yuvim, nakupak yume chidum, enyach amoyam David, enyach makav emoyam ukath. I'm half Mojave. My father is not Mojave. That's what I said.
it helps to say a few words in Mojave, but most of them, my kids are half saying and half. These half that, and they have to talk English, and I try my best to hang in that.
But most of the time, even though she didn't feel good, she would get up and she would come out and even still try, because she knew that time was short.
Harrington, he recorded about 30,000 pages of notes on the Mojave language. Would you like to see what's on them?
Yeah. I would like to hear it and see what they said.
What does Batai mean? Batai means big. Big. Batai is big. And it's anything that's big, Batai. Spirit Mountain. How would we say that? Spirit Mountain.
Every day I try to have the recordings out It makes me happy and sad, I will say, to hear her voice and to hear her talking.
I don't know that well. What do you call that? Okay. And some of them that I don't remember very good. And some of them that come back to me. Some that I have forgotten. Okay. And getting old doesn't help either.
It broke my heart to see that she tried so hard to give everybody what they needed before she left us. She was a treasure of ours, one of the treasures. And to lose such a great treasure, we don't know what we're going to do now. You know, I have the recordings, I have all that. But it's up to me, she said, to give it.
I think it probably was a godsend for Harrington, for him to even have that type of concern about, language survival. And he probably may have seen what was happening to us as a people, that, everything that we had was taken away. And even to the point where the language, is trying to be erased, from us as a civilization and as a culture.
Some languages have been lost, some communities are gone, but as long as there's a committed effort and devotion to revitalize languages, then that's going to be very important to Indian people themselves and to their ideas and expression of their worldviews.
I always kind of go back to my father, my grandmother, and they've always made sure we knew that we were Indian. I wish she'd be proud. Her people struggled. To wake up every morning and to know no matter where you are or where you go in life, that you come from a strong people and your roots go deep into this earth, and to always know that the elements of this world today come down on you, that you just have to root yourself.
It's not an easy process to bring back a language when all you have is field notes and recordings. It takes a long time, it takes a really dedicated person to do it.
In 2003, the tribe approached me and said, would you like to create a language program for us, or we'd like to bring the language back. That's a dream come true.
Dr. Applegate translated Harrington's notes when he did his dissertation in linguistics. And from there, we've created a dictionary story, and we work directly with Harrington's notes. We've used it to bring our language back to our people.
Kasi. Oh, okay, but here we go. Suddenly it gets more interesting. So, oh, okay, can you make that out? Do you get the root of that? Smach, so, yeah, he mach is exactly, mach is like with a cord or a rope. So mach zitlin is he grabbed it or tied it by the feet.
It's emotional. It's emotional because you have the sadness of why am I learning like this? Why am I learning in this linguistic way? I wish I had an elder to speak to me and teach me. It is emotional when you go full circle with it.
The power in the word. I often reinforce to them that they're the only ones in the world that speak this language. Okay? They acknowledge that, and they understand that. Vacas. Oh, Yiti Vacas. It's that sense of empowerment and entitlement. And it's great to see our youth so well rooted, because it carries them far, having that strong foundation of who they are, the ancestors, what they've been able to leave for them. So it helps them.
I'm the daughter of the last speaker of the Barbarania Chumash. Oh, my first memory, and I was just a kid. He was just a big, tall, thin, Ichabod-looking guy. Just came right up the steps looking for my mother.
Ernestine's mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother all worked with Harrington. He recorded first-hand information from these Chumash speakers. So you have a generational survey of Barbarania Chumash, which is almost unheard of in Native American languages.
He'd come over about late in the morning. He made sure he had his meals, because my mom made some of his meals. And he was comfortable in our house. I mean, we were a house of 19 and very poor, and it was a very old house, as I say, 2 bedrooms, but it had a dining room. And there was a doorway opening, and there's curtains over it. And he would have those curtains pulled all the time so nobody could see him if they walked in the house. And even my own mother said, gee, I wonder why. But that was just his demeanor.
Mary Yee, who was the last native speaker of any of the Chumash languages. And every day he would walk over about a block away to Mary Yee's house from the hotel we were staying.
My mother, she wasn't able to continue the language once her mother died. Then Harrington came along, so she was still able to continue her language with him. Sometimes he'd give me $1 or $2 just to get me out of the house. And I was an annoyance to him. He'd sit there for hours on end, and they'd sit together, and it was like, I don't know, like family, because they'd argue back and forth sometimes over a word. He finally retired, I think, late 50s, and he started showing signs of failing health. So my mother told me, eventually he has to see a doctor. So after all of the rigmarole, she finally got him to see her doctor, and he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. So then he ended up being fed by my mother. She would make special dishes for him, because that's one of the things that goes, your swallowing ability. 4:24 p.m. JP says he has been pretty ill last night. Pain in the stomach. Okay, here we are again, 1:17:59, 4:07 p.m. JP made it here. Here he is. Says that he is not any better. And to the point where she had to bathe him eventually. And that's when my other daughter would be tickling his feet and he'd be laughing. JP says, didn't sleep at all last night. Every time he tried to sleep, his arm and hand shook something awful. How long will he be coming over? We don't know. It's kind of ironic and justified that in his last year or years, he was nursed by an Indian that he spent his 50 years with, up until the point where he couldn't get out of bed, and that's when they called his daughter to come and get him. He died a lonely person, I'm sure, down there. And it wouldn't have been that way if he was here.
We'll soon be dust. The time will come when there won't be an Indian language left. All the languages developed for thousands of years will be ashes. The house is afire. It is burning.
So is the house on fire now?
Yeah.
It's still on fire, but it hasn't burned down.
Well, right now I'm introducing my granddaughter to the language for the first time in her life. So I'm hoping that she's going to fall in love with it, pick up the torch and run with it.
I've always been kind of interested in. I'm just busy with life and other things that I finally made the time to come down here and learn it and spend time with my grandma.
Eka I no meka sakti anshinik nui hihos apiho. Eka sa anshin.
It's pretty powerful to listen to my great grandma tell the stories because I never met her. Overwhelming. I hope I can learn it, but there's a lot of stuff that I need to study. Even the sounds are completely different. A lot of work.
None of us had any idea what the extent of that documentation was. But as soon as he died, as soon as he was gone from the scene, we began to find out.
Box after box after box of his material started arriving from all over the country.
First off, there was the contents of his house in Santa Ana and another house in Santa Barbara. Then the storage facilities began to report it.
In the Salinas Valley, there was a Salinan Indian man who had an old chicken coop. He stored these boxes of notes in the chicken coop.
To make a long story short, I found that I was saddled not with several dozen boxes of material, the Smithsonian, but with 6 tons of material to sort through somehow. It wasn't just notes on California Indian languages. Among these packets of material on Indian languages, I found half-eaten sandwiches, dirty old shirts. He did not take adequate care of his personal life. He sacrificed everything for this calling.
I've heard estimates of these total tribal languages that he has set down in writing or recording that exceed 150 different tribes.
Over the course of more than 50 years, he assembled more than 1 million pages of field notes, handwritten field notes mostly.
John Harrington's notes number, well, there's more than 1 million pages, maybe even 2 to 3 million pages of notes. So they're vast, and they were more than one man's career really could encompass to process all this material, to work it up for publication.
The people who are the language activists now are the ones generally who did not get their language in childhood because their parents or their grandparents had either had the language taken out of them so that they didn't even know it anymore, or had been punished in the boarding school so that they made a decision not to use it with their kids so that their kids wouldn't suffer. And so, but their kids and their grandkids are saying, there's something missing in our lives. We want a connection back to our culture and back to our language. And so these language activists are pioneers in biculturalism and bilingualism and an attempt to refine the native identity within the United States.
Do you think there may be any more notes out there?
There are certain portions of John Harrington's notes that we know are still missing. And one hopes that they've been preserved somewhere.
We always said, well, my family, he had this cute crooked smile, you know, when he, like a cat who, you know, got the canary, he had this one tooth missing, and when you could see that when he smiled, you knew that's what he was thinking or feeling, and I assume that's what he's doing right now, looking down on us. Like, Yeah, now you get it. Because a lot of people didn't. But the thing about the Indian people is they somehow in their hearts accepted and knew without any explanations.
Give not the yawning graves their plunder. Save the lore for future ages' joy. The stories full of beauty and of wonder, the songs more pristine than the songs of Troy. The ancient speech forever to be vanished, lore that tomorrow to the grave goes down. All other thought from our horizon banished, that any sacrifice our labor crown.
This project was made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, calhum.org, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Thank you for hanging in there.
Is your mic on?
More technical difficulties.
It's a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions?
Tell us what's happening at Pechanga. I know there's a native speaking school.
There is. So the school was started back in, before my time. So about 2002, it was started as a preschool, and my director now, Gary Dubois, he had just come back from going to college, and he wanted his daughter, who was just beginning preschool age, to learn a language. So he tracked down another linguist, Eric Elliott, who also studied Harrington's material, and drug him away from a teaching job in San Diego, Utah Elementary School, to come work for Pechanga. So they started an immersion program with the teachers at the school, and it's still going strong. They teach several subjects in the language, including math. So just the challenge is, when teachers leave, then he has to reteach the teachers the language. So that's a little bit of a drawback. But now, there's several. Let's see, the kids now are that started the program are now graduating college. So there's about 12 kids that went through the whole school, process and learned the language, and they're pretty fluent, I would say. They wouldn't say that, but.
I was wondering at the beginning if he had any dealings with Charles Fletcher Lummis, and I think I heard his name once, but then as the movie went on, he realized what a loner he was.
Yeah.
But Lummis was kind of a strange guy too, so maybe, I don't know.
Right. So in addition to all of his notes, there's also 8 reels of like 800 pages or more, 1600 pages or more of correspondence. So he did correspond with Lummis. And if you notice, there's a couple pictures of him posing nude.
Yeah.
So has anybody been to the Southwest Museum in the old building? So if you go downstairs, the original entrance, there's dioramas that line the. So Harrington was the model for the artist that made all those dioramas. So he wanted to be very accurate in how he posed. So he insisted on doing it in the nude. And that's why you see him playing the flute. And so needless to say, I've seen the pictures and they're very accurate too. Making a canoe, yeah. So, we call it the Harrington naked photos, yeah.
A little odd too, I guess.
Yeah, they got along. And Lummis gave Harrington some office space at the Smithsonian. So he also left some material, Smithsonian, the Southwest Museum. He also left material at the Southwest Museum, and they're in Lummis's collection. Yeah.
And one other quick question, I found out online that the Cultural Center is not open, or only open for appointments, or it's gonna open again, or?
Oh, our facility? Well, it's.
Lisa, will you repeat the question just so?
Bonnie was wondering if our cultural center is open. Well, it's never really been open to the public. It's been open by invitation or by tour. But I'm happy to say that the tribe's in the process of building a brand new curation facility. So we'll have not only new storage space, but also a Harrington room to house all of the, we have all the microfilm, Harrington microfilm, with 2 microfilm readers, and meeting space. So we'll have outdoor and indoor space for gathering, so hopefully they'll be working around soon. But I also wanted to mention that Harrington's notes are available now on the Smithsonian website, so you can go on and view this material. So.
You know, years ago, I read a book, and the part of the title was something about an angry God.
Encounter with an Angry God.
Yes, yes. Now, who wrote that? I'd like to read
that
it.
That was Kara Beth Laird.
Oh, was it? Okay, okay.
Yeah. It's a great read. She's a good writer.
It was, yeah.
And just a little side note, I was contacted. So when I was at UC Davis, my linguist professor there, she convinced me. She said, "Hey, have you heard of Harrington?" I'm like, "No." You should take a look at his notes. You're interested in studying Luiseno, so she got me hooked on Harrington. At the time, the notes were only available on microfilm, and she ended up writing a grant to purchase this large microfilm reader. So I'd sit in the office and look at all these notes in the dark. So this database that she created, I was the guinea pig and I worked on it. It was to transcribe Harrington's notes verbatim. So Indian communities wouldn't have to try to, first of all, decipher his handwriting. You saw his handwriting. The images that Dan included were pretty good. Usually you can't read his writing. So to enter it verbatim into a database so communities could search for words or actually read it, neatly read it. And so that was through UC Davis, and I think the links to the database are still live. And so someone contacted me out of the blue, and she said, "I live in San Diego, and I saw these people cleaning out this apartment building, and I have to say, I did some dumpster diving because it appeared that there was like important information. It turned out to be Kara Beth Laird's collection.
Wow.
Turned out to be
I love those stories.
Yeah, and photos from her family. Yeah, and she ended up, she was living in this little apartment in San Diego, and when she was getting, she had some health issues. She went to go live with some friends, and they never cleaned out this little storage room that she had. So, thank goodness, she contacted me and said, "I'll come down and get them." So Kara Beth Laird, actually, she became really famous with the Chemehuevi community. She published 2 or 3 books on Chemehuevi, on the culture and the language, and so it was her manuscripts from those books that were in that. So that was nice. The rest of that. But yeah, that's a great book, Encounter with an Angry God. You could probably get it through the library, or probably even buy cheap copies.
Yeah, I'm gonna read that. It was very good.
Yeah, it was very good.
He was eccentric.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Yeah, there were some excerpts in there from the book.
Yeah.
If you caught that, yeah.
So, Luiseno, that's a cover word for, there are multiple tribal groups.
Correct.
Is it one language? Or
There is.
Okay.
Yes. So the name Luiseno is from being associated with San Luis Rey Mission. So any Native people that ended up at the mission, they could have been from anywhere, ended up with that term, which stuck in the American period, or Mission Indians or Luiseno. So and then it became known as like an anthropological term to identify the larger tribe, which consists of 7 different bands now. Saboba, Pachanga, Paula, Palma, La Jolla, Rincon, and the San Luis Rey group, which are non-federally recognized, and they live, the villagers run the mission. So that's all the same language. The language family is fairly large, and there's a little excerpt about it in there. But so Chemehuevi, up into like the Paiutes, those are all the same language family. Shoshone, that's the same language family. Down into Mexico, and the language family is Uto-Aztecan. So that's a pretty large linguistic group.
this is just a side note, but my husband was telling me today that they used the Navajo language during the war because the Japanese couldn't translate it.
Right, World War II, the Navajo code talkers, they tried 2 other languages too. They tried, I think it was Chickasaw and Cherokee, and but they stuck with Navajo because the Navajo, the people that they recruited were able to come up with a code within Navajo. So it's not just Navajo; they came up with terminology for different like aircraft and so yeah. I think all the Navajo code talkers are now passed. Maybe there's one left.
I think he's recently passed.
Yeah.
Are there recordings of the music of
Yes.
these Okay.
Yes, so there's over 1,300 recordings that we know of in Harrington's collection at the Smithsonian. And some of those are online. You can go on and listen to them. A lot of them are interviews in the language. Some of them, like for the local group here, he interviews people of Pechanga, and the person he interviewed mixes Spanish and the language. So, and then there's songs that are recorded as well.
A number of years ago, when I was still working with the Temecula Valley Museum, we had some history panels, and the 3rd grade teacher at Pechanga wanted to have those come in. So in the process of taking them into the school, we passed by the preschool area, and they had all these kids. It was all the requirement was they had to be potty trained, and they had to come with an adult, one of their parents or somebody, and they were sitting on the floor, and those little 2-year-olds were learning colors and learning how to count and everything, and then of course, as you went by the 1st grade class, they were getting a lot more language, and the 3rd grade class was getting a lot of it as part of their daily curriculum.
Yeah, the 3rd grade teacher, she's been at Pechanga for many, many years, so she's pretty well versed.
An enthusiastic young lady.
Yeah, she is. Yeah, well, they have things up on the walls, like in the language, in all the classrooms. There's now a couple books that Pechanga has a press, Great Oak Press, so they publish some books in the language for kids, little hardback books.
I just recently, well, a few years ago, read a very interesting book about the Willie Boy story.
Oh, uh-huh.
And it's from the Indian point of view.
Right.
And it is so different from the movie that came out in the 70s.
Right.
And there's some evidence that he was alive and he went to Chemehuevi and lived out his life. And I got it at the bookstore. I can't remember the name, but it was the Willie Boy story.
Harry Lawson, I think. Lawson is
It's
one version.
Yeah, but it was very interesting.
They just did a movie. Oh God, what's his name? Aquaman. What's his name? Jason Momoa. He just did it. They just did a movie, a remake of Willie Boy. It was supposed to be released right at the beginning of COVID, so I don't know how long it's going to hang on to it.
That would be interesting.
Yeah, they recruited some local people to be in the back.
Yeah, and it's got the connection with the Gilman Hot Springs, and the Indians would work the fruit orchards there, and it's just really interesting. His feats of athleticism and running just a good book. Good book.
So how many of the tribes are working on getting their language back, like you guys are, and at San Isabel and
I would say, as far as the tribes getting the language back, working on language revitalization, all the tribes in Southern California know for sure. The Cahuilla, they have a few language programs at the different reservations. Serrano, the San Manuel does as well. Natives Harrington material.
That's what I was gonna ask.
Yeah.
I think that's the basis of.
Yeah.
That's an amazing treasure that you
It is, and it's just getting through the material is just difficult because it's not really organized. One thing I wanted to say too is that several people have passed away since this movie was done.
Yeah.
So it's like a memorial. So Catherine Callahan, the woman from Ohio State, so she was a grad student at Berkeley, which she said in the film. and she was sent to go deal with Harrington too. He was still alive too, and they were trying to contact him, and he wanted nothing to do with her organizing his material. And I think maybe he was too, physically sick to go, but she gave a presentation at Davis, and she talked about the things she found in the boxes: uneaten sandwiches, dirty shirts, uncashed paychecks, and she said literally everything was bound in red tape, like the government issued red tape, and so we had all the blood. And her job was to sort through the piles, and with not knowing which language was in each pile. Not knowing if it was one language in the pile, so they literally had to spread things out. So if you imagine all of that material was then at the Smithsonian, and you had to go there up until the mid-80s to actually see it. So then they got this grant to do the microfilm, but to organize it for the microfilm, really they had to just like group that. This looks like this looks like that. So when you're going from the notes, even though the guide says place names, it may not all be place names.
It's amazing that there's still a machine around that could play those old recording discs.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
put it into a digital form or something.
And it wasn't until the 90s that they were able to do that. There was one particular company, Cutting Corporation, that the Smithsonian contracted with some of their other recordings, like the Folk Life. I don't know if you're familiar with the Smithsonian's Folk Life series. So they spent a lot of time and energy getting those recordings transferred. And so, but they didn't really spend a lot of time on Harrington material. So it was actually the tribes that paid Cutting Corporation to go in and do the copies. And at that time it was to cassette. It wasn't even digital yet. So then from the cassette, they had to digitize it.
8-track or something. Honor, right?
Yeah. So it was early 90s that I think that we, at least for this area, for Louis Sagan.
Go back to the 60s. The first postgraduate paper I worked on was, we had to go through those readers, and it was on John Ross, the sheriff of Trail, and we're looking at his thing.
Microfiche?
Microfiche.
What happened to his daughter? Does anyone know?
It's just kind of a sad story. Yeah, so she, because they didn't have a relationship, and basically when he went to go stay with her, he passed fairly soon after he went to go stay with her, and then she died in a car accident in San Diego.
Oh,
yeah.
no grandchildren or anything?
No.
The genius didn't skip a few generations.
No.
Okay.
And his personal belongings that she took, they ended up at UC San Diego. Sorry, San Diego State. So they have a Harrington collection. It's mostly physical objects, like baskets that were gifted or bought.
Was she very old?
No, I think she was in her early 50s. Yeah, it was the late 70s.
The daughters are talking about?
Yes, early 70s. So he died in 61. Yeah.
What about Cara Beth?
Cara Beth, well, she I'm trying to think of when she passed. She passed in the mid to late 80s, I believe. And she was in her early 90s. Do the math. Yeah. But she ended up living, like I said, with some family friends, and then she wrote Encounter with an Angry God in the 80s, and then she was like a phenomenon. She did all these book tours and signed books. Yeah.
Interesting life.
Yeah.
How did her second marriage work out?
Great. Yeah. They had a ranch in
Santa Ynez.
not Valley Center, south of San Pasqual, like the Ramona area. And so she had 4 kids with George Laird. So all of those kids that we know have moved back. She showed away to live on the reservation.
Well, we appreciate the time, effort, and
Very good.
Tell us a little bit about the movie that Pechanga is making about the Temecula Massacre.
Yes.
I know it's probably kind of guarded at this moment, but can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes. So we applied for a National Battlefield Protection Grant through the National Park Service. And the only other entity that received this type of grant is San Pasqual Battlefield. And so we actually got it. So it was basically to document the Temecula massacre. It started out as just a technical report, just pulling all the sources together. If anybody's really read local history, it's kind of, the massacre kind of spread throughout various sources. You kind of piece it together to figure out the chain of events. And so we wanted to make that really concise in one volume, and hopefully we'll be turning that into a book as well, the technical report. So as we're in the process of doing this research for this report, we thought we should have Dan do a movie about this. So we petitioned National Park Service and we asked if we could allocate some of their funds toward a film, and they were excited about it. They said yes. So it's about 45 minutes. We need to do some more editing. It's a little dry in some sections, so hopefully it is created for the public, so it will be available at some point, just not yet.
So it'd be nice to see it here.
Yeah, we're hoping that we can turn the technical report into a book fairly quickly. It just needs some fine tuning, taking out some of the academic writing, per se, and maybe package it as a book and a video, especially for the schools, local schools. So. I'm not gonna say that. Yeah. Hopefully within a year.
All right, well, thank you.